A jazz drummer's ride cymbal beat is their fingerprint, their identity. When we hear drummers like Kenny Clark, Max Roach, Billy Higgins, Jimmy Cobb, Elvin Jones, Tony Williams, Roy Haynes, Jack DeJohnette, Bill Stewart, Brian Blade, Marcus Gilmore. Okay, I'm getting carried away. We can recognize them instantly by how they play the ride cymbal. But it isn't just how they play the ride cymbal. Their cymbal beats defined new eras and innovations in jazz. And today, we're going to talk about how you can put some of that magic into your own playing. Hey everyone, Michael D'Angelo here. If you're new to the channel, I'm a professional drummer and educator, and this channel is devoted to sharing my perspective on music and playing the drums. So I've been teaching in higher education now for almost 15 years, working with students of all different backgrounds and experience levels. And in that time, I've begun to develop my own approach to teaching jazz and playing the drum set. Now, of course, there's already tons of great videos and educators here on YouTube, and I want to start sharing some of my own perspectives on the music and maybe offer a different approach on fundamental topics. I've been fortunate enough to study with some great teachers throughout my life, all of them having different perspectives on the music and the instrument, and I found that invaluable to my own approach as a musician and a teacher. So today I want to talk about the ride cymbal in a way that you may not have thought about. So let's get into it. Most of us are already familiar with the jazz ride cymbal pattern, which sounds like this. Now, the way I like to think of the jazz ride cymbal pattern is based off of a driving quarter note pulse with the addition of skip beats on the and of 2 and the and of 4. This quarter note pulse aligns perfectly with the walking quarter notes of the bass player, and the skip beats provide the feeling that the music is based off of. Now, when we're first starting out, we learn that swing is triplet based, and to play swung eighth notes, we play those eighth notes on the first and third part of the triplet. On paper, it looks like this. But when we listen intently to our jazz drumming heroes, they're not necessarily playing the eighth note exactly as triplets. They might play it tighter, almost like a dotted eighth 16th rhythm. Or it's looser, almost straight eighths, but not quite. Notice that all three of those examples I showed you have entirely different feels to them. And something I always think about when it comes to playing jazz and the ride cymbal is by adjusting the spacing of the skip beat with the quarter note, you can drastically change how the music feels. As jazz drummers in the 21st century, we're called upon to play music from all different eras of jazz, whether it's bebop, hard bop, post-bop, swing era, ECM, the list goes on and on. And of course, we have what's happening in jazz today as well. When we think about all of these different eras and the drummers that played in them, they were all simply playing the music that reflected the time period they were in. That's why when we think of drummers with specific ride cymbal sounds, we also associate them with a certain era in jazz. For example, Billy Higgins and Art Blakey were two of the house drummers on Blue Note Records that define the sound of the hard bop era. But then if you listen to, say, Tony Williams or Elvin Jones, their ride cymbal sounds represented a whole new way of playing with post-bop jazz in the 1960s. Now, obviously, this is a concept that is much bigger than where to put the skip beat, so if you want to see more videos on the ride cymbal in the future, let me know down in the comments. The point I'm making is that by understanding these different feels, how to play them, and what musical context they fit in, we can play in a way that's both musically appropriate for the style, but we can also start to put our own personality into our ride cymbal playing. But first, a quick side note before we begin. This concept we're going to talk about today fits really well into medium tempos, say around 120 to 225 beats a minute. You'll find that as the tempo gets faster, the eighth notes tend to even out, and at slower tempos, they tend to stay triplet based. So keep this in mind when you practice at various tempos. Usually, if your gut tells you it doesn't feel good, it probably doesn't feel good. So let's explore this spectrum and talk about each ride cymbal feel. To start, we'll look at the ride cymbal right down the middle, playing our eighth notes on the first and third part of the triplet. This gives a nice round sound and a relaxed feel that still drives the band with energy. Drummers that come to mind are Max Roach with Clifford Brown, Philly Joe Jones on the 50s Miles Davis Prestige recordings, Paul Motion with Bill Evans. It's a very all-around sound. So here's an example of what your standard triplet feel sounds like. So I think this is a great home base feel when you want the music to have energy and direction, but not too pointed and not too forward. Now that's where our second feel comes in. So when you want the music to push forward with a driving, quarter note focused feel, then tightening up the skip beat will give you that momentum and intensity. The tighter you go, the more pointed the sound. Now this approach has a certain bounce to it. A lot of my musician friends will call this tippin', and I personally view it as a more staccato approach compared to the triplet ride cymbal feel, which is a more legato approach. I always think of Jimmy Cobb on Freddie Freeloader when I think of this feel, and another great example that one of my students recently transcribed is Tony Williams on Herbie Hancock's Alliloquy Valley. That's a great example of tightening up the skip beat. Now, of course, the great Art Blakey comes to mind too, who was the master at intensity. Lastly, we'll go in the other direction, into almost even eighth notes, but not quite. You could think of this as half straight, half swung. And to be honest, this particular feel doesn't work in every musical situation, but when it does work, it works extremely well. For example, tunes that have a boogaloo feel like the Sidewinder or the Jody Grind, this feel works perfectly for those kind of tunes. Now, of course, the drummer on those recordings was Billy Higgins, and Billy Higgins instantly comes to mind when I think of a player that exemplifies this particular ride cymbal sound. Now, of course, you can also use it as a texture when you want the music to have a lazier, almost behind the beat feel. And Elvin Jones, in certain contexts, pulls this off really well. One of my favorite recordings that opened me up to this kind of playing is a track called Contemplation off of McCoy Tyner's The Real McCoy. All right, so that gives you an idea of these essential ride cymbal feels. And of course, there's everything in between. But now that begs the question, what ride cymbal feel should I choose? Now, it's important to note that all of the drummers I've mentioned, along with almost every other drummer and musician that plays music, not just jazz, will play with different feels. And that's because the music tells them how to play. So a few things you may want to consider when choosing what ride feel to play on a particular song. Number one, does the style of tune give you a reference point with a certain feel? For example, a boogaloo tune that we talked about earlier, or a driving shuffle feel, both of those tunes require two different eighth note feels. Number two, do you feel like the music needs more forward momentum? Does playing with a tighter skip beat help propel the music forward, or does it clash with what's happening in the rest of the band? And speaking of the rest of the band, number three, how are the other musicians playing? If they're playing with a pointed, high-energy feel and your approach is more relaxed, the music will never settle. Now, one of the best ways to internalize this concept is to listen and play along with recordings from all different eras of jazz and from many different drummers. Listen to how they play the ride cymbal and how that fits into the music. The greater your association between the two are, the easier it is to rely on your intuition in any given musical situation. With all of that said, how do we actually practice this concept in addition to playing along with records? Now today I'll show you two ways you can effectively work on this concept, one that's very fundamental and one a little more advanced. To start to internalize these different feels, we can take any set of rhythms and practice them as comping exercises focused on these different ride cymbal feels. Now in my book Melodic Systems, there are what I call partials at the beginning of each section. Partials focuses on every possible rhythmic combination in a given subdivision. So if you have a system you want to use the book with, but are finding you're having trouble getting the system off the ground, you can use the partials pages to get familiar with every possible rhythmic combination in context before trying the studies and melodies pages. In this case, we can use partials 1 on page 10. On this page is every possible rhythmic combination of quarter notes and eighth notes in 4/4 time. There's also offbeat eighth notes, which are simply the quarter note partials displaced to the offbeat. We're going to focus on the offbeat eighth notes to work on matching our left hand to the eighth note feel in the ride cymbal. Now you can loop each measure individually, or you can practice them sequentially. So I'll demonstrate each ride cymbal feel with the swing pattern on the ride cymbal, 2 and 4 on the hi-hat, feathering the bass drum on all 4 quarter notes, and then playing each partial on the snare drum with the left hand. And we'll do that at quarter note equals 142. So there's going to be a lot of playing in the next few sections, so feel free to use the timestamps in the video to jump around to different examples, and you can quickly compare the different feels back to back using those timestamps. So, all right, here you go. All right, so when that becomes comfortable, we can move on to practicing these different feels in a way that fits more with the musical context you might find them in. So this is where using something like melodic systems really comes in handy, because for each system, you can find a page in the book that will work well with that system. So I'll demonstrate each of these feels with a system that's a little bit more advanced so that you can hear how you might apply these feels to playing in a musical situation. All right, for a triplet-based ride pattern, we can utilize one of the pages in section 3, which are triplet-based rhythms. Now, of course, you can swing the eighth notes in section 1, but this section focuses on incorporating the second part of the triplet. And this is really good to practice the triplet flow between your hands and really dial in that spacing of the skip beat on the ride cymbal. For our wider eighth note feel, we can expand on the boogaloo concept we talked about earlier. Now, sometimes when we think of a boogaloo groove, especially like in a tune like the Sidewinder, we associate that groove with a repetitive pattern. But we can use something like melodic systems to practice rhythms where the snare drum and bass drum interact with each other. So this system would work really well for coming up with different combinations that you could use to improvise within a repetitive groove. Finally, for our tip-in feel, or our dotted eighth 16th feel, we can be inspired from another example I mentioned earlier, which is Jimmy Cobb on Freddie Freeloader. So one way I come up with systems to use in melodic systems is taking something I hear on a record or in a musical context and then reverse engineer a system that I can use to practice that concept. So in the case of Freddie Freeloader, I can take the dotted eighth 16th feel on my ride cymbal, hi-hat on 2 and 4, and play a cross stick on beat 4. That'll be my system, and then I can practice different rhythms on the bass drum as a comping voice. So I'll take studies 1, 2, which are eighth notes in 2-note groupings, and I'll play those rhythms on the bass drum. This is a good page to really hear how the spacing of 2 eighth notes starting on the downbeat are different than 2 eighth notes that start on the upbeat. Now, of course, if you want to go even one step further, you can combine these exercises with playing along to records. In that way, you'll have to really adjust your spacing to fit into whatever you're hearing. And that's really the ultimate goal for this kind of practice, which is to not have to think about the right feel for any tune, rather using your instinct and adapting to what's happening around you. Remember that every musical situation and every tune is different. And of course, musicians play in different ways. So by working on all these approaches, it will allow you to play what the music needs every time. All right, so I hope that this gives you a little bit of insight on how powerful your ride cymbal can impact how the music feels. Now, in the meantime, I'd love to hear from you. Is this something that you've worked on before, or is it a concept that you haven't yet thought about? Let me know down in the comments below. Now, of course, the ride cymbal in jazz is a huge topic that we could devote several videos on. But what I really want to do is how to develop your own voice on the ride cymbal, how to take what all of our masters have done and find your own individual voice with the ride cymbal. So if that's interesting to you, make sure to click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos when I release them. Now, if you want to check out melodic systems for yourself or book a one-on-one lesson with me, you'll find links in the description to my website. And while you're there, you can also sign up for my newsletter to stay up to date with things happening in my world. But with that said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.